At 06:30 hours on June 6, 1944, Gefreiter Heinrich Severloh crouched inside a concrete bunker overlooking a stretch of sand the Americans would soon call Omaha Beach. He was 20 years old, a farm boy from Lower Saxony who had never fired a weapon at another human being. In the next 9 hours, that would change in ways he could never have imagined. The bunker was designated Widerstandsnest 62, one of 15 fortified positions along this sector of the Atlantic Wall. Severloh had been assigned there 3 months earlier. He had helped dig trenches, string barbed wire, and position the machine guns that now pointed out toward the English Channel. He knew every meter of the beach below. He knew exactly where the tide line fell, where the sand gave way to rock, where men trying to cross would have to bunch together in the kill zones his officers had carefully plotted. Through the morning mist, Severloh watched the horizon fill with ships, hundreds of them, then thousands. He had been told the Atlantic Wall was impregnable. He had been told the Americans were soft, undisciplined, unprepared for real war. He had been told many things. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Bernhard Frerking, had told him the night before that if the invasion came, they had to stop it on the beach. Not in the hedgerows, not in the villages. On the beach, Field Marshal Rommel himself had said that the first 24 hours would be decisive. If the enemy got a foothold, Germany would lose the war. None of it prepared him for what came next. What Heinrich Severloh witnessed that morning, and what he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand, was the beginning of a profound shift in how German soldiers viewed their American enemy, a shift that would transform contempt into confusion, confusion into grudging respect, and respect into something approaching fear. This is not a story about battles. This is a story about perception, about how an entire army of professional soldiers was forced to reconsider everything they believed about the men they were fighting. And it begins not on the beaches of Normandy, but in the sun-baked deserts of North Africa, 18 months earlier. In February 1943, the soldiers of the Afrika Korps had every reason to feel confident. They were veterans. They had spent 2 years fighting the British across Libya and Egypt. They had been led by Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself. They knew how to win. These men had survived the furnace of desert warfare. They had learned to fight in sandstorms that reduced visibility to nothing. They had mastered the art of tank combat across vast open spaces where a single tactical mistake meant death. They had faced British Commonwealth forces at Tobruk and El Alamein. They had pushed to within 60 miles of the Suez Canal. They considered themselves, with considerable justification, among the finest soldiers in the world. When word came that American troops had landed in Morocco and Algeria as part of Operation Torch in November 1942, the reaction among German soldiers ranged from amusement to outright contempt. One lance corporal from the 15th Panzer Division wrote home in mid-February 1943 with a typical assessment. "We fought the army a few days ago," he said, using the German slang for Americans, "and destroyed over 90 of their tanks. We will blow him and all his rabble to perdition." This attitude was not merely arrogance born of victory. It was rooted in deeply held beliefs about American society itself. German propaganda had spent years portraying the United States as a decadent nation, obsessed with money, weakened by racial mixing, incapable of producing real soldiers. The prevailing view in the Wehrmacht was that Americans were amateurs playing at war, while German professionals did the real fighting. The Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943 seemed to confirm everything the Germans believed. Rommel's forces tore through inexperienced American units, inflicting over 6,000 casualties, including approximately 300 killed, 3,000 wounded, and 3,000 captured. American tanks burned in the Tunisian hills. American infantry fled in disorder. American commanders lost control of their units. The problems in the American force were real and numerous. Units were scattered across wide frontages without adequate coordination. Communications broke down repeatedly. Some replacements had arrived at the front only days before the battle, many of them never having completed basic training. One regiment received its first shipment of bazookas on February 12th and had to learn how to use them against actual German armor 2 days later. Major General Lloyd Fredendall, commanding the American Second Corps, had positioned his forces in ways that invited disaster. Units were dispersed across a 30-mile front, task forces were fragmented and unable to support one another. When the German attack came, American formations were defeated in detail, one piece at a time. German tank crews spoke of the Tunisian fighting with something approaching joy. After years of facing the methodical, well-supplied British, they found American units disorganized and easily panicked. Panzers rolled through American positions that should have held. Infantry scattered before German pressure. Officers lost contact with their men. Rommel himself initially shared his troops' dismissive view. He had studied the American positions, noted the scattered deployment of their forces, and identified what he called fundamental weaknesses in their tactical thinking. The Americans, he believed, were years away from becoming competent soldiers, but something happened during those 5 days at Kasserine that Rommel did not expect. Something that planted the first seed of doubt in German minds about their assessment of American fighting capability. On the 4th day of the battle, American resistance stiffened. Artillery fire, which had been sporadic and poorly coordinated at the start, suddenly became devastatingly accurate. Infantry units that had broken under the initial assault reformed and counterattacked. The withdrawal that Rommel had expected to become a rout instead became an organized fighting retreat. By February 22nd, Rommel made a decision that surprised his own staff. He ordered a withdrawal, not because he had been defeated, but because the Americans were no longer behaving like the beaten enemy he had anticipated. In his personal papers, Rommel later recorded his revised assessment. The tactical conduct of the enemy defense had been first class, he wrote. They had recovered very quickly after the first shock and had soon succeeded in damming up our advance. That phrase, recovered very quickly, would become a recurring theme in German assessments of American forces for the rest of the war. The Germans had expected the Americans to break. Instead, they bent and bounced back. What Rommel and his officers could not see was the machinery of change already grinding into motion behind American lines. Within weeks of Kasserine, heads began to roll. General Fredendall was relieved of command and replaced by George S. Patton, a vastly different kind of leader. Omar Bradley came in as assistant corps commander. The entire command structure was reorganized. More importantly, the American army learned. Officers who had witnessed the debacle analyzed what had gone wrong and implemented corrections. Units that had been scattered were consolidated. Training programs were intensified. Communication procedures were overhauled. Artillery coordination, which had been sporadic at best, became a priority. The speed of this adaptation shocked German commanders, who expected the Americans to require months or years to digest their lessons. Instead, improvements were visible within weeks. At the Battle of El Guitar in late March 1943, just 5 weeks after Kasserine, American forces faced another German attack. This time they held. American artillery shattered German armor columns. Infantry stood its ground. The Germans withdrew, having accomplished nothing. This pattern of rapid learning would define the American military experience in World War II. Unlike armies built on long traditions and rigid doctrines, the Americans proved willing to throw out methods that did not work and adopt new ones that did. They learned from the British. They learned from the Germans. Most importantly, they learned from their own mistakes, and they learned fast. The German army in Tunisia was eventually trapped between American forces, advancing from the west, and British forces pressing from the east. On May 13, 1943, the remnants of the Afrika Korps surrendered along with over 260,000 Axis troops. It was a catastrophe for Germany, second only to Stalingrad, and among those captured were many of the veterans who had mocked American soldiers just 3 months earlier. But the full implications of what this meant would not become clear until the summer of 1944, until Normandy, until men like Heinrich Severloh saw with their own eyes what American industrial power and American determination could actually accomplish. The morning of June 6, 1944, changed everything the German soldier thought he knew about fighting Americans. Severloh was positioned in Widerstands Nest 62, a fortified resistance nest overlooking what the Allies had designated as Omaha Beach. He manned an MG-42 machine gun with a clear field of fire across several hundred meters of open sand. Below him, The first waves of American infantry would have to cross that killing ground under his guns. When the landing craft appeared through the morning fog, Severloh began firing, and he did not stop for hours. The weapon in his hands was an MG-42, one of the most effective machine guns of the war. It fired at a rate of 1,200 rounds per minute, so fast that individual shots blurred into a continuous roar. Below him, American soldiers had to cross several hundred meters of open sand while exposed to this fire. There was no cover, no concealment, just sand and water and the slow dying of men who had nowhere to hide. Severloh later estimated that he fired over 12,000 rounds that morning. He went through several barrels as they overheated. He fired until his hands were blistered, and his ears rang, and the smell of burnt propellant filled the bunker. He fired until he ran out of machine gun ammunition and switched to a rifle. He fired until the Americans finally broke through the defenses, and he was forced to withdraw. What happened on that beach has been described in countless histories, but the German perspective reveals something different from the American accounts of heroism and sacrifice. From behind his machine gun, Severloh watched wave after wave of American soldiers fall. He watched them pile up at the waterline. He watched the tide come in and move the bodies. And he watched something else. He watched them keep coming. This was the detail that German soldiers across Normandy reported with a mixture of disbelief and horror. The Americans did not stop. Landing craft were destroyed, and more appeared. Men were cut down on the sand, and more ran forward to take their places. Entire units were annihilated, and fresh units landed to continue the assault. A German wireless operator, assigned to a bunker near Severloh's position, later described what he experienced that morning. On that night of June 6th, none of us expected the invasion any more, he said. There was a strong wind, thick cloud cover, but then, in the night, the air was full of innumerable planes. We thought, what are they demolishing tonight? But then it started. One message followed the other. Parachutists landing here, gliders landing there. Finally, landing craft approaching. In the morning, a huge naval force was sighted. That was the last report the advanced observation posts could send before they were overwhelmed. And it was the last report they received about the situation. It was no longer possible to get an idea of what was happening. Wireless communications were jammed, cables cut. Officers lost grasp of the situation entirely. When this soldier was eventually captured and saw the scale of what the Allies had assembled, his reaction summarized what many Germans felt. At first, I was rather depressed, of course, he said. I, an old soldier, a prisoner of war after a few hours of the invasion. But when I saw the material behind the enemy front, I could only say, "Old man, how lucky you have been." A German officer from the 352nd Infantry Division, defending the sector next to Severloh's position, later described the psychological impact. "We had been told the Americans were poor soldiers," he said. "We were told they would not fight, but they came across that beach into our guns. They kept coming. We killed them, and still they came." No soldier who experienced this could maintain contempt for such an enemy. The physical scale of the invasion compounded the psychological shock. German defenders looked out at the English Channel and saw an armada that defied comprehension. One captured German soldier marched past supply dumps that had been established on the beach within hours of the landing, reportedly made an observation that became famous among logistics officers. "I know how you defeated us," he said. "You piled up the supplies and then let them fall on us." He was more right than he knew. The war in Europe was what the Germans called a material Schlacht, a battle of material, and the Americans fought this battle on a scale the Germans could barely imagine. Within 48 hours of the initial landings, more than 130,000 troops had come ashore. Within a week, over 300,000. The Allies had constructed artificial harbours out of prefabricated components shipped across the Channel. They had created a port where no port existed. German officers who had studied the impossibility of supplying an invasion force across open beaches now watched the impossible happening in front of them. These artificial harbours, codenamed mulberries, were engineering marvels. The Allies had sunk old ships to create breakwaters. They had floated massive concrete caissons across the Channel. They had assembled pontoon bridges and piers that could rise and fall with the tides. A new port appeared on the French coast over the space of days. German officers who had fought from France to North Africa and Russia, who had heard of the logistical impossibilities that had doomed Operation Sea Lion, looked at this and understood they were fighting something unprecedented. What are you fighting? How can you win? There was no more stopping the Allied advance than stopping the weather itself. What was coming was not an army, but a force of nature. There had been no port from which to fight, so the Allies made one from sand and steel. The comparison with German logistics was stark. The Wehrmacht was still heavily dependent on horses for transport. Their motor pool was a cobbled-together mess of German, Italian, captured French, and captured British vehicles, each requiring different spare parts that were chronically unavailable. German soldiers often went hungry, while the Americans seemed to have unlimited food, ammunition, fuel, and equipment. Taking an American supply depot was like finding a gold mine. German soldiers who captured American positions were astonished by the abundance. Everything a fighting man needed was organized and waiting. Rations that included chocolate and cigarettes. Medical supplies, spare parts, fuel. The contrast with German deprivation was demoralizing. The German experience at Normandy forced a fundamental reassessment of American military capability. But it was not just the materiel that impressed German soldiers. It was how the Americans fought once they got off those beaches. In the hedgerow country of Normandy, American infantry tactics evolved with a speed that alarmed German commanders. Units that had performed poorly in the initial days adapted their methods within weeks. They developed new techniques for clearing the dense bocage. They integrated tanks, infantry, and engineers into combined arms teams. They learned to call in devastating artillery and air support with remarkable coordination. The bocage was terrain ideally suited for defense. Ancient hedgerows, centuries old, divided the Norman countryside into thousands of small fields. Each hedgerow sat atop an earthen embankment thick enough to stop a tank. The vegetation was dense enough to hide machine gun positions. Every field was a potential killing ground. German forces used this terrain expertly. They had dug in, established interlocking fields of fire, and prepared to bleed the Americans for every meter of ground. In the early days after the landings, this strategy worked. American units took heavy casualties trying to push through the hedgerows using tactics designed for more open terrain. But then the Americans adapted. Someone, the exact origin is disputed, came up with the idea of welding steel teeth onto the front of Sherman tanks. These teeth, fashioned from German beach obstacles, allowed tanks to cut through the hedgerow embankments rather than climbing over them, which had exposed their vulnerable undersides to German anti-tank weapons. Within weeks, thousands of American tanks had been modified. Infantry tactics evolved alongside the equipment. Small unit leaders developed techniques for coordinated assaults on hedgerow positions. Artillery forward observers perfected methods for calling in accurate fire on concealed German positions. Engineers blasted gaps for armor. Air support learned to work closer to friendly troops without causing friendly casualties. The Germans watched this evolution with alarm. They were accustomed to fighting enemies who took months to adjust their methods. The British, in particular, had been slow to change. The Americans changed in days. Ideas flowed up from privates and sergeants to colonels and generals. Solutions that worked were immediately shared across units. The entire army seemed to learn as a single organism. Field Marshal Rommel, now commanding the defense of Normandy, noted this adaptation with concern. "The enemy's tremendous superiority in artillery," he wrote in a report to Berlin, "and even more in the air, has broken the front open. Also in evidence is their great superiority in artillery and outstandingly large supply of ammunition." The American artillery system was unlike anything the Germans had faced. It was not just the number of guns, though those numbers were formidable. It was the sophistication of how those guns were employed. American fire direction centers could coordinate multiple batteries to fire simultaneously on a single target in what was called time-on-target missions. All the shells arrived at the same moment, giving enemy soldiers no warning to take cover. German veterans spoke of American artillery with something approaching reverence. The accuracy was stunning. The volume was overwhelming, and it seemed to arrive everywhere, all the time, without end. One German officer described lying in a trench while American shells fell for hours, unable to move, unable to fight back, just waiting for the barrage to end or for a shell to find him. The small Piper Cub observation planes that American artillery battalions used became symbols of impending doom. German soldiers learned that if they could see one of those little aircraft circling overhead, their position had been spotted, and artillery fire was imminent. The Germans called them their most hated enemies, more feared than tanks or infantry. Air power compounded the artillery advantage. American fighter bombers roamed behind German lines, attacking anything that moved. Truck convoys were destroyed on the roads. Trains were strafed in their stations. Individual soldiers learned to freeze at the sound of aircraft engines, knowing that any movement might draw an attack. German reinforcements moving toward Normandy had to travel at night and hide during the day. Units that should have reached the front in hours took days. Fuel and ammunition that should have resupplied frontline troops was destroyed before it arrived. The Germans found themselves fighting with one hand tied behind their back while the Americans seemed to have unlimited resources. But what truly changed German perceptions was not American firepower. It was American aggression. German veterans who had fought against the British, the French, and the Soviets reported something distinctive about American combat behavior. One former Wehrmacht soldier, interviewed after the war, described it this way: "The British were competent and professional, but slow. They would only attack with absolutely overwhelming force. The Russians were capable soldiers, but their tactics were often crude. The Americans were different. What struck German soldiers most was American aggression. If there was something different between Americans and the other European allies, it was how they reacted to an attack. The other allies would immediately return fire and edge their way to a more favorable position. Americans would immediately return fire, bring a punishing rain of artillery or air power on top of whatever they were fighting, and move to counterattack as soon as the bombardment ended." German veterans described this combination of firepower and forward momentum as unlike anything they had experienced on other fronts. This aggressiveness caught German forces off guard. They were accustomed to measured responses, to enemies who would consolidate gains before pressing forward. The Americans pressed forward immediately. They accepted casualties that would have caused other armies to pause, and they kept attacking. German veterans compared this to nothing they had experienced before. The British would attack methodically, with careful preparation and overwhelming force, but they would also stop to reorganize after achieving an objective. The Soviets attacked with mass and disregard for casualties, but often without tactical sophistication. The Americans combined the aggression of the Soviets with the organization of the British and added their own distinctive willingness to improvise. German veterans who survived the Normandy campaign consistently described American tactics as relentless. The tempo never let up. Before defenders could recover from one attack, another would hit them from a different direction. Losses that would have stalled other forces seemed only to fuel American determination. It was exhausting just trying to survive against such constant pressure. This tempo of operations, maintained day after day and week after week, wore down German defenders. Units that had been at full strength were ground down to shadows. Officers who had survived years of fighting were killed or wounded. The relentless pressure, combined with overwhelming firepower and endless supplies, created conditions under which effective defense became impossible. At the same time, German soldiers noted a contradiction that confused them. These same aggressive fighters treated prisoners and civilians with a consideration that seemed incompatible with their ferocity in combat. German propaganda had warned soldiers to expect brutality from the Americans. Instead, captured Germans often found themselves offered cigarettes, chocolate, and medical treatment. The contrast between expectation and reality left many prisoners stunned. They had been told Americans would be cruel and vengeful. Instead, they found captors who followed the Geneva Convention, provided medical care, and treated prisoners with a dignity that many had not expected from any enemy. German officers who became prisoners noted the informal relationship between American officers and enlisted men. The lack of rigid hierarchy surprised them. American officers ate with their men, joked with them, and treated them as colleagues rather than subordinates. This informality, which German military culture would have considered a weakness, seemed to produce soldiers who fought with initiative and determination. This combination of combat ferocity and humane treatment created cognitive dissonance for German soldiers. The enemy was simultaneously more aggressive in battle and more civilized in victory than they had expected. The propaganda image of the soft, decadent American had collided with reality, and reality won. By December 1944, German forces in the West had been pushed back to their own borders. Hitler, desperate to reverse the tide, gathered his remaining reserves for one final offensive. Operation Wacht am Rhein would strike through the Ardennes forest, the same route German forces had used to defeat France in 1940. The goal was to split the Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. The Battle of the Bulge would become the largest battle ever fought by the United States Army, and it would provide the final proof of how completely German perceptions of American soldiers had changed. The offensive was Hitler's personal gamble. Against the advice of his generals, he had gathered virtually every reserve the Wehrmacht could scrape together. 3 armies, over 200,000 men, nearly 1,000 tanks. The goal was audacious: strike through the same Ardennes forest that had enabled German victory in 1940, split the Allied armies, capture Antwerp, force the Western Allies to negotiate. German commanders were skeptical. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and Field Marshal Walter Model both believed the plan was too ambitious given the resources available. Model reportedly told subordinates the plan had no more than a 10% chance of success. But Hitler would hear no objections. The attack would proceed. On December 16, 1944, over 200,000 German troops with nearly 1,000 tanks launched a surprise attack against American positions, thinly spread across 85 miles of the Ardennes. The timing was deliberate. Hitler had waited for weather conditions that would ground Allied aircraft. Heavy fog and snow blanketed the region, neutralizing the air superiority that had devastated German forces in Normandy. The initial assault achieved complete tactical surprise. American units, many of them inexperienced or exhausted from previous fighting, were overwhelmed. In some sectors, German forces advanced 50 miles in the first few days. The surprise was total. Allied intelligence had failed to detect the massive German buildup. Commanders who should have been alert to the possibility of attack had convinced themselves the war was nearly won. The Ardennes sector was considered a quiet area, a place to rest weary divisions and train new ones. Some American soldiers were so complacent they called it the Ghost Front. German forces exploited this complacency ruthlessly. Specially trained commandos wearing American uniforms infiltrated behind Allied lines to spread confusion. They changed road signs, cut communications wires, spread false rumors. American security procedures collapsed into chaos as soldiers tried to distinguish real Americans from German infiltrators by asking questions about baseball and state capitals. For a moment, it seemed the old German assessment might be vindicated. American units broke. Thousands surrendered. The most inexperienced division, the 106th Infantry, lost 2 entire regiments, over 7,000 men, in one of the largest mass surrenders in American military history. But then, something happened. Something that crystallized everything German soldiers had learned about their enemy over the previous 2 years. American forces at the crossroads town of Bastogne refused to retreat. Surrounded by German forces demanding their surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe sent back a one-word reply: nuts. That single word communicated something the Germans had come to understand through bitter experience. The Americans would not break, they would not quit, they could be killed, but they could not be made to stop fighting. The defense of Bastogne became legendary. The town sat at the junction of 7 roads, making it essential for German logistics. Without Bastogne, the German offensive could not be sustained. So the Germans demanded surrender, and the Americans refused. Inside the perimeter, conditions were desperate. The 101st Airborne Division, which had been rushed to Bastogne, was low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Wounded men lay in makeshift hospitals without adequate care. The weather was brutal, with temperatures well below freezing and snow falling constantly. German forces surrounded the town completely. Yet the defenders held. When German attacks tested the perimeter, American paratroopers threw them back. When ammunition ran low, soldiers scrounged from the dead and captured enemy weapons. When artillery support seemed impossible, forward observers found ways to call in fire from guns that should not have been able to reach. The defense was resourceful, determined, and utterly stubborn. On December 26th, elements of General George Patton's Third Army broke through to Bastogne. The relief force had travelled over 150 miles in winter conditions, fighting through German resistance the entire way. This movement, executed in just days, was considered one of the most remarkable achievements of American logistics and leadership in the entire war. At the critical road junction of St. Vith, American armoured forces held out for 6 days against overwhelming odds, buying time for Allied forces to organise a response. Small units of engineers and infantry delayed German spearheads by defending crossroads they had no realistic hope of holding. Soldiers burned or moved critical gasoline stocks to keep them from German tanks that were desperately short of fuel. The speed and accuracy with which American artillery responded to the offensive astonished German commanders. Units that had been in disarray 48 hours earlier were suddenly delivering coordinated fire that shattered German formations. At Elsenborn Ridge in the northern sector of the Bulge, American forces massed almost 350 guns and created what German soldiers described as a wall of steel. The 6th SS Panzer Army, Hitler's elite formation, literally ran into this wall. Their advance stopped cold. When the weather cleared on December 23rd, American air power entered the battle. The impact was devastating. German tanks, trucks, and troops that had been moving freely under cloud cover were suddenly exposed to relentless attack. Fuel supplies that were already critically short were destroyed on the roads. The offensive, which depended on speed and momentum, ground to a halt. Fighter bombers appeared in waves. P-47s carrying bombs and rockets attacked German armour columns. C-47 transports dropped supplies to besieged Bastogne. Medium bombers hit German supply depots and rail lines. The sky, which had protected the German advance for days, now became their enemy. German soldiers who had experienced the full weight of Allied air power in Normandy recognized immediately what this meant. The window of opportunity was closing. Without fuel, tanks became steel coffins. Without ammunition, artillery fell silent. Without supplies, men starved and froze. The fuel shortage became critical. German tanks, the heart of the offensive, could not move. Some crews drained fuel from one vehicle to enable another to advance. Others abandoned their machines entirely, unable to refuel them. The 116th Panzer Division reached the end of the battle without a single operational tank because there was no fuel to run them. By mid-January 1945, the Bulge had been eliminated. German losses exceeded 100,000 killed, wounded, or missing. More importantly, the Wehrmacht had expended its last reserves. There would be no more offensives, no more counterattacks, only retreat. The human cost was staggering on both sides. American casualties exceeded 80,000, including over 19,000 killed. It was the costliest single battle in American history. But while American losses could be replaced, German losses could not. The men, the tanks, the fuel, the ammunition expended in the Ardennes represented resources Germany could never recover. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill called the Battle of the Bulge undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war. German soldiers who survived it came away with a different kind of assessment. They had seen an army that could absorb a devastating surprise attack, stabilize its lines, and counterattack with overwhelming force, all within the span of a few weeks. When one German armoured commander was asked what he thought of the American soldier now, his answer was brief. "What is the point in this? I have a wife and children." The question contained its own answer. Against an enemy with unlimited resources, unlimited determination, and the demonstrated ability to recover from any setback, continued resistance was futile. By spring 1945, German soldiers were surrendering in unprecedented numbers. Over 317,000 were captured in the Ruhr pocket alone, twice what American intelligence had estimated. Many actively sought out American units to surrender to, preferring American captivity to falling into Soviet hands. The Ruhr pocket was the death knell of the Wehrmacht in the West. American and British forces had encircled Germany's industrial heartland, trapping nearly 350,000 Axis troops. Day after day, American loudspeakers broadcast surrender appeals. Day after day, the pockets shrank as German units ran out of food, ammunition, and hope. German soldiers made their decisions based on what they had learned about their enemy. Those on the Eastern Front knew what capture by the Soviets meant. The atrocities committed by German forces in Russia were being repaid with interest, but capture by Americans was different. Word had spread through the Wehrmacht that Americans treated prisoners according to the Geneva Convention. They provided food and medical care. They did not execute surrendering soldiers. This knowledge shaped German behavior as the Reich collapsed. Units fought desperately to escape westward so they could surrender to Americans rather than Soviets. Soldiers discarded their weapons and walked toward American lines with hands raised. Officers negotiated surrenders for entire divisions. The contrast with the Eastern Front could not have been more stark. Against the Soviets, German soldiers fought with the desperation of men who knew capture meant death or the Gulag. Against the Americans, surrender became a rational choice. Better to spend the war in an American prison camp than to die in a hopeless battle. One German soldier, asked why he surrendered so readily, gave an answer that captured the transformed German view of the American enemy. The Germans should have thought of some of these things before they began the war, he said, particularly before attacking the Russians, but when given a choice between captors, he was glad to surrender to the Americans. In 2017, a German man named Günter Graue, then 91 years old, rode an electric bicycle onto Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington state. He had made this journey to say thank you. Graue had been captured in Normandy in August 1944, wounded by a grenade at age 18. He was transported to a prisoner of war camp at what is now Joint Base Lewis McChord. What he experienced there defied everything he had been told about Americans. Instead of brutality, he found ice cream and Coca-Cola. Instead of forced labor and starvation, he found work that paid 80 cents a day and food more abundant than anything available in wartime Germany. He wrote later about standing in front of a shop in the prison camp, trying to decide whether to buy ice cream or Coca-Cola, and suddenly realizing how incredibly lucky he had been to be captured by the Americans rather than the Russians. Graue was not unique. Across the United States, German prisoners of war were held in camps that many remembered as the most comfortable period of their wartime experience. They worked on farms, they learned English. Some formed friendships with American guards and local civilians that lasted the rest of their lives. There were over 400 prisoner of war camps scattered across the United States during World War II, holding nearly 400,000 German prisoners at the peak. The camps became small German communities in the American heartland. Prisoners produced newspapers in German. They organized orchestras and theater groups. They played soccer on fields surrounded by barbed wire. Many American farmers came to rely on German prisoner labor. The prisoners harvested crops, cleared land, and performed the agricultural work that American men who had gone off to war could no longer do. Some farmers developed genuine respect for the work ethic of their German laborers. Some Germans were surprised to find that the American hatred they had been led to expect simply did not exist. The treatment was not perfect. Conditions varied from camp to camp. Some prisoners faced hostility. Some suffered abuse. But compared to what prisoners of war experienced elsewhere in the world, including what prisoners held by Germany experienced, American POW camps were remarkably humane. Food was plentiful. German prisoners ate the same rations as American soldiers. Medical care was provided. The work was often hard but not punishing. Education programs were available. Religious services were permitted. The contrast with the starvation, brutality, and murder that characterized German POW camps for Soviet prisoners was absolute. Some German prisoners actually gained weight during their captivity. This detail, trivial in itself, became symbolic of the American approach. The Americans had resources to burn. They could afford to treat even their enemies well. This abundance was itself a demonstration of national power that impressed German prisoners far more than any propaganda could have. This treatment created a powerful impression that persisted long after the war. German veterans who had fought against Americans often spoke of their former enemy with a respect that surprised younger generations. They had expected monsters and found human beings. They had expected barbarity and found a strange combination of overwhelming violence in battle and genuine decency in victory. Heinrich Severloh, the machine gunner from Omaha Beach, survived the war. He returned to farming in Lower Saxony and tried to forget what he had done on June 6, 1944. But the memories would not leave him. For years, Severloh told no one about his experience on the beach. He went about his life, married, raised a family, worked the land. But at night, the images returned. The landing craft, the soldiers running through the surf, the bodies piling up on the sand, the endless firing. In 1959, Severloh came across a series of magazine articles about D-Day, written by journalist Paul Carell. Reading through the accounts, he noticed something strange. None of them mentioned the section of beach he had defended. The position that he knew had inflicted devastating casualties on the American assault had simply been left out of the story. Severloh contacted Carell, who recognized him as a valuable witness. Through the journalist's connections, Severloh was able to contact other veterans who had defended the same sector. Together, they pieced together what had happened that morning. In 1963, Severloh returned to Normandy for the first time. He visited the American cemetery overlooking the beach where he had fired his machine gun. He walked among the white crosses marking the graves of men he may have killed. And he wept. The cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer holds the remains of over 9,000 American servicemen, most of them killed during the invasion of Normandy. The white crosses and stars of David stretch across manicured lawns overlooking the very beaches where they fell. For Severloh, walking among those graves was confronting the human cost of his actions in a way that could not be avoided or minimized. Later, through the efforts of historians, Severloh was put in contact with an American veteran named David Silva, who had been wounded on that same beach. The two men met in Normandy in 2004, 60 years after the battle. They embraced. They cried together. They spent 4 days filming, reliving the events that had brought them together. Before they parted, both men agreed this would be their last trip to Normandy. It was their way of ensuring they would never meet again in this life. Severloh died in 2006. Silva followed in 2010. The transformation in how German soldiers viewed American troops between 1943 and 1945 was profound and complete. It moved from dismissal to respect to something approaching awe. At Kasserine Pass, German veterans expected a quick victory against soft amateurs. By the end of the Bulge, they had learned that American forces could absorb catastrophic setbacks and emerge stronger. They had seen an industrial capacity that could supply endless replacements of men and material. They had experienced artillery and air power so overwhelming that individual courage and tactical skill became irrelevant. But perhaps the most important lesson German soldiers took from their experience fighting Americans was also the most surprising. The enemy they had been taught to despise as weak and decadent proved to be not only militarily formidable, but also, in victory, remarkably humane. Field Marshal Rommel, who had first encountered American forces at Kasserine, came to embody the changed German perspective. His initial dismissiveness had transformed into professional respect. The enemy he had once expected to crush in weeks had instead improved relentlessly, learned from every defeat, and never stopped advancing. In 2001, German historian Sönke Neitzel discovered a remarkable archive in the British National Archives. Hidden in recently declassified files were thousands of pages of transcripts, secretly recorded conversations between German prisoners of war. These men had spoken freely, believing their conversations were private, revealing their true thoughts about the war, about their enemy, about what they had experienced. The discovery was extraordinary. During the war, British and American intelligence had bugged prisoner of war camps with hidden microphones. The intent was to gather military intelligence, information about German weapons, tactics, and troop dispositions. But the recordings captured far more than that. They captured German soldiers talking to each other, as only soldiers do, without the filter of propaganda or the need to maintain morale. Neitzel eventually found additional transcripts at the National Archives in Washington, over 150,000 pages in total. The recordings covered soldiers from all branches of the German military, from privates to generals, from early captures to late surrenders. Together, they provided an unprecedented window into the German soldier's mind. In these apparently private conversations, the soldiers talked freely and openly about their hopes and fears, their concerns, and their day-to-day lives. With a banality that can appear shocking to modern readers, they also talked about the horrors of war, about violence, about death, and repeatedly, about the enemy they faced. In those recordings, German soldiers discussed the Americans with a frankness impossible in official channels. They talked about the overwhelming firepower they had faced. They talked about the relentless American aggression in combat, and repeatedly, they expressed a grudging respect for an enemy they had expected to despise. The recordings revealed that German soldiers generally respected the British and Americans, but not the Soviets. They spoke of American material abundance with a mixture of envy and despair. They discussed American tactics with professional analysis. And they acknowledged, in words they would never have put in a letter home, that the enemy they had been taught to underestimate was anything but weak. One recorded conversation captured the evolution in German thinking. A veteran explained to a newer prisoner that the Americans were not what propaganda had promised. They were not soft. They were not cowardly. They combined overwhelming material resources with an aggressiveness in combat that caught German forces off guard. The professional soldiers of the Wehrmacht had expected amateurs, and instead found an enemy who learned faster, adapted more readily, and never stopped pressing forward. The German experience of American soldiers in World War II offers a lesson that extends beyond military history. It is a lesson about the danger of underestimating an enemy based on cultural assumptions. It is a lesson about the gap between propaganda and reality. And it is a lesson about how quickly confident contempt can transform into fearful respect when confronted with evidence that contradicts cherished beliefs. German military culture in the 1930s and 40s placed enormous emphasis on warrior tradition. The Wehrmacht saw itself as the inheritor of Prussian military excellence, heirs to Frederick the Great and the victories of 1870 and 1914. They had been trained to believe that German military prowess was unmatched, that their professionalism and discipline would overcome any numerical disadvantage. The United States, by contrast, seemed the opposite of everything the German military valued. American society was diverse and democratic. American military traditions were short and, in German eyes, unimpressive. American soldiers were civilians in uniform, not professional warriors. The assumption that such men could never match German soldiers in combat seemed almost self-evident. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The Americans learned faster than the Germans expected. They adapted more readily. They absorbed casualties that would have broken other armies and kept fighting. They brought industrial resources to bear on a scale that made German efforts look like cottage industries. By 1945, the Wehrmacht had learned to fear the enemy they had once mocked. Not because American soldiers were individually superior, though many proved themselves excellent fighting men, but because the American system, the combination of resources, flexibility, aggression, and determination, created a fighting force that could not be stopped. The German soldiers who faced Americans between 1943 and 1945 learned that lesson the hard way. They paid for their initial dismissiveness in blood. By the end, the Wehrmacht had lost nearly 600,000 men as prisoners in the West alone, most to American forces. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, over 1 million American soldiers stood on German soil. They had crossed an ocean, broken through the Atlantic Wall, fought through the hedgerows and forests and mountains of Western Europe, and defeated an enemy that had conquered most of a continent. The journey from Kasserine to Berlin had taken just over 2 years. In that time, the American army had transformed from an inexperienced force that could be routed by veteran German units into a juggernaut that crushed everything in its path. The Germans had watched this transformation happen, had been on the receiving end of it, and had learned painful lessons about the danger of underestimating an enemy. The materiel imbalance alone was staggering. American factories produced nearly 50,000 Sherman tanks during the war, more than Germany's entire tank production across all types. American shipyards launched more tonnage in a single month than the Germans could sink in a year. American training programs turned out pilots faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. The numbers were simply insurmountable, but numbers alone did not defeat Germany. Far greater numbers of men, and still struggled against the Wehrmacht for years. What made the Americans different was the combination of abundance with adaptability, resources with willingness to learn, overwhelming force with tactical flexibility. German soldiers noticed all of these qualities. They noticed that American units which performed poorly one day performed better the next. They noticed that American solutions to tactical problems spread rapidly through the army. They noticed that American commanders were willing to try new approaches rather than clinging to doctrine that was not working. This flexibility, more than any single weapon or tactic, made the Americans dangerous. The German soldiers who witnessed this transformation carried their memories for the rest of their lives. Some, like Günter Graue, came to feel gratitude toward their former enemy. Others, like Heinrich Severloh, carried guilt and sorrow that never fully healed. All of them had been forced to abandon the comfortable certainties of propaganda and confront an uncomfortable truth. The Americans were not what they had been told. They were something far more formidable, and by the time German soldiers understood this, it was far too late. That is the lesson that emerges from the German experience of American soldiers in World War II. Perceptions formed in ignorance can persist only until they collide with reality. And when that collision occurs, the awakening is often brutal, final, and irreversible. The veterans who survived that collision, on both sides, spent the rest of their lives processing what they had experienced. Some found reconciliation, like Severloh and Silva meeting 60 years after trying to kill each other. Some found peace, like Graue riding his bicycle across an ocean to say thank you. Some never recovered, haunted by memories that no amount of time could diminish. But all of them, German and American alike, knew something that can only be learned through direct experience. They knew what war truly costs. They knew what men are capable of, both the worst and the best. And they knew that the enemy they had been taught to hate was, in the end, made of the same flesh and blood and hopes and fears as themselves. If you found this exploration of history compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more of these untold perspectives from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these hidden stories from history. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, from veterans to history enthusiasts, and you are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.